Good morning, Winchester Public Library. This is Erin. Happy Monday. I'm here with you from the library today in a different room, mixing it up. I'm wondering if anybody's going to join us today or if it's just going to be me talking and you guys watching later on Facebook or YouTube, which you're welcome to do. I'm going to get started. Hang on, we're telling more followers to join your video. I was going to use a filter today for fun, but it just didn't really seem like, what we're going for here. Today, I would like to talk to you about audiobooks. What do you think about audiobooks? If anybody has a comment, not now, because I don't think anybody's here, but later on as we're talking, and if you have a comment about how do you feel about audiobooks, let me know. People have passionate feelings about audiobooks, I find. I mean, people who don't like them really, really don't like them. I am not a big consumer of audiobooks, although I have found some that I love. But today we're just going to talk about what works with audiobooks, what doesn't work, why some people prefer them, what format of books is great for audiobooks. And I'll make some recommendations of my own and others that have come from lists that I've read and interviews that I've heard. So when you listen to a book, you get a unique experience that you don't get when you're reading. And most of the time that is the way that we hear the author's words in our head when we read them to ourselves is very different than how they're interpreted through a narrator. And a great narrator can make for an excellent reading of an audiobook. I think the narrator makes or breaks the experience for the reader. There are more audiobooks now than ever. On average, I think about 50,000 audiobooks are published per year. It's becoming a huge way to consume books, and I think now more than ever, certainly in the last several months, as we haven't been able to get to the library or to a bookstore to get a physical book, we've been able to still take digital audiobooks from the library. And so maybe you're having a bit more exposure now than you have had in the past to audiobooks. And I'm here to tell you how to enhance that experience a little bit. I think for audiobooks, what can turn people off sometimes is that it can be hard to focus on them. And I think like anything else, this is a learned, something that you can learn. And I recommend that if you're new to audiobooks, you just try to take them in smaller chunks at the beginning instead of trying to like press on where you might sit down and read 100 pages of a book. Some audiobooks are 17, 25, 30 hours long. So it's not really reasonable to think that you're going to sit there and listen to, the first 2.5 hours of an audiobook, unless maybe you're going on a long trip or something like that in your car. And you sort of have to train your brain to keep paying attention to the story. But just like with books that you read, you can be reading a book and you can sort of drift off and thinking like, what am I going to have for dinner tonight? What am I going to get at the grocery store? 3 or 4 pages have gone by and you really realize that you've been looking at the words, but you haven't been really understanding them or taking them in to go back, reread your pages. This happens a lot in audiobooks until you sort of train your brain to pay attention. But it's not a reason that you should be deterred from using an audiobook. To think, oh, well, I just can't pay attention, or if my complaint has always been, I find them so relaxing to listen to, like they just kind of lull me into the state of relaxation, which is true because I often will put audiobooks on at night when I'm getting into bed, and that's probably not the time that my brain is paying the most attention anyway. It might be better for me to put on an audiobook when I go for a walk, when I walk the dog, or when I'm shopping at the grocery store, which I try to do now because I find that it de-stresses the whole being out in the world experience for me a little bit. Or if you clean your house or if you're running errands, it can be a great time to listen to an audiobook. It's also an excellent use of time. We don't have hours and hours in a day to sit and read generally, but especially when you're getting into a good book, you kind of just want to put everything else aside and sit and read. But you can listen while you do other things. So you're sort of like, and it's an efficient use of your reading time and of your lifetime, like living time. There's also some discussion about whether or not listening to books counts as reading, which it 100% does. Don't ever let anybody tell you that reading a book is not the same. Listening to a book is not the same as reading it. If you are listening, reading, you're doing the same thing. You're taking in a story, and you're doing it in a way that your brain is paying attention. There's a man, Daniel Willingham, at the University of Virginia. He's a psychologist, and he's done some research on how our brain consumes audiobooks versus books on paper. And he has discovered that for the mental process involved in paying attention to reading and listening, there's not really that much of a difference. In fact, one of the differences is that we do a two-step process when we're reading a book on paper. First we decode the language, which is what we're doing when we're reading the written words. We're decoding them and to figure out the words, the print words, and then we're processing the language as we absorb the language. So what listening to a book actually does for you is it takes out one step of that, which is decoding the language. So our attention can be very different, but it's still drawing on the same parts of the brain that are processing the information that you're hearing. We're skipping the decoding step because we're not looking at the words, but so 100% counts as reading. We are still being active when we're listening to a book as we are when we're reading. Like I said, it's easy to zone out when you're doing either of them. It's easy to zone out when you're really doing anything. Have you ever driven your car and suddenly find yourself at home and you don't remember the 3 red lights you stopped at to get there and the right turn you took on the regular road, because it's just such a force of habit that you've sort of like absorbed it without really paying attention. And we do that when we read. We do that when we listen. You can zone out in the middle of a conversation. You can zone out in the middle of a page. But don't think that listening to a book is any less than reading it. We want you to just have great experiences with all of the books. So however you have time and attention to give to them right now, just go for it. There are all types of books that you can listen to on audio. Any book that you can physically read, you can listen to pretty much. You can do history books, you can do fiction, nonfiction, mystery, suspense. Some of these can be a lot of fun to listen to. Again, it comes back to the narrator a little bit. How do you find a good narrator? There is a website called, well, you can talk to your favorite librarian, first of all. And some of the librarians here are really into audiobooks. You can go to a website called audiofilemagazine.com. That's audiophile with an F. And this is a website that is dedicated to reviewing audiobooks, as many audiobooks as they can. They review about 2,500 audiobooks per year. They have about 100 reviewers that are doing this, and it was born out of one woman's passion for audiobooks, and she just wanted there to be a place where people could go to get lists, reviews on audiobooks, best of lists, and understand who narrates them, the backstories of the narration. So if you go to this website, you can find all kinds of lists going back years. She's got blog posts, and there's also a podcast called Behind the Mic from Audiophile Magazine. And this podcast comes out daily, and each day a reviewer will give you a brief review, very brief synopsis, under 5 minutes of the audiobook of the day that they're reviewing. And this can be a great way to get really enticed into listening to an audiobook before making the commitment of taking out an audiobook that might be 10 or 12 hours long or more. So it's little snippets. If you have a genre that you like, or if you know of a narrator that you really like, you can give this a try. Another great idea that has been one that I've sort of discovered on doing some reading about audiobooks is that some books that you love have been obviously turned into audiobooks, but they're very, very popular audiobooks because a certain narrator has done it, or it's been done with a certain style. So I would recommend, if you're new to audiobooks and you'd like to give them a try, take a book that you've already read, that you've really loved, and listen to it on audiobook. I am going to do this for The Handmaid's Tale, which I've read several times, but has been narrated for audiobook by Elizabeth Moss, who plays Offred in the TV series, which I have not seen either. So I am going to take a listen to that because I love the book so much, and I think that it could be a really fun experience to listen to it in her voice. Another great way to get into audiobooks is to listen to memoirs, if you like memoirs. And even if you're not actually crazy about memoirs, or you think you don't like them, if you listen to an audiobook of a memoir, they're most often read by the author of the memoir. And that can be a really great way to get that individual's story to you in the way that it was intended to be heard. A narrator, when they're narrating an audiobook, is really interpreting the words of the author. And that isn't always necessarily giving the intention behind the author's words, but when you're listening to a memoir that's read by the person that wrote it, you're pretty much hearing the book in the way that they wanted it to be heard. And this works really well with comedic writers. Any actor or comedian has a memoir, pretty much, if you look them up. Notably, I'm thinking of Tina Fey has a memoir, or maybe two, I think one, Bossy Pants. She reads it, it's funny. If you like Tina Fey, and you just like the sound of her voice in your head, it's a great book. Amy Poehler has one, Mindy Kaling has a couple, which are great. Samantha Irby has a couple, which are great, comedic, just essays almost, but read in her voice, read with her delivery, a lot of fun. Another great one that I would recommend to anyone who's interested in audiobooks and hasn't tried one is Trevor Noah's memoir, Born a Crime. He was born during apartheid in South Africa, and his father was white and his mother was black, and mixed race children at that time in South Africa it wasn't legal to be born, it wasn't legal to have a mixed race child. So he was literally born a crime, that's where the title comes from. And apartheid ended when he was about 5 years old, and then he and his mother could live free in South Africa, and they were free to travel, but his life was one of chaos and violence and abuse and poverty, and the book is really a love letter to his mother, who worked very hard to try to break the cycle of this pattern in his life for him. He is a funny man. It's not a funny book. It's not a funny story. He's funny in his storytelling. It's very bittersweet, but in his voice, the story really takes off, much more than it would, I think, if you read it off the page. I listened to this one, and I highly recommend it as an audiobook for people who maybe think they don't like audiobooks. Becoming by Michelle Obama is another one. It's her memoir, story of her growing up. She reads it in her voice. She does a beautiful job at the narration. You get a good feeling of who she is and what motivates her, more than I think you would if you were reading the words off the page again. Another memoir that I just read and didn't listen to, but I have listened to snippets of it, and I've also listened to some of her readings on Instagram, is Glennon Doyle's new memoir, Untamed, which is her story of a divorce, remarriage, blending a family, trying to find joy without being responsible for the joy of all of the people in her life, trying to identify what brings her own joy and listen to her own voice. She's a great storytelling style. She's great to listen to. That would be a good one to listen to. And Malcolm Gladwell is another one who he's got a few different books, and he reads all of them in audiobook form. He also has a podcast, Revisionist History podcast. And if you like that, and if you like Malcolm Gladwell, his books would be great to listen to, because they're really almost done in a podcast style, where he at times sort of interviews people, and it sounds like he's talking to you. It doesn't sound like he's reading words off the page. Another way to get into audiobooks, if you're not into them, is to read or listen to a book that's narrated by someone that you really like, even if it might not be a book that you're super into. I did this earlier this year with The End of the Affair, which is a 1951 book by Graham Greene. And hi, Paula. And this is a book about a man whose affair with a woman ends abruptly, and he is desperate to find out why, and he eventually does. There are 3 characters in the story. It's him, the woman he's having an affair with, and the husband of the woman he's having an affair with. But it's read by Colin Firth. And Colin Firth has a wonderful speaking voice and a wonderful cadence of speech and a wonderful style. And he does great characterizations, which is what happens when you have a single narrator, but you want to differentiate between different characters. So he can't just speak in one voice the whole time, because you wouldn't necessarily know when the wife is speaking or when the husband's speaking. So he changes his voice very subtly to become different characters, and it's very clear. And if you like Colin Firth, if you like many, many different actors, there are all kinds of actors that voice books. But that was a good one that I enjoyed. Another book that I listened to this year when it came out actually was The Dutch House by Anne Patchett, which is, I highly recommend the book anyway, but the audiobook was read by Tom Hanks, who I love, and it was an absolutely divine listening experience for me. It is the first time I've listened to a book where I have just sat down on the couch, making myself a cup of coffee, and set aside, almost like I would set aside reading time, like an hour of reading time. I did just sit and listen. I loved it so much. He was also great at characterization, very subtly becoming different characters in the book. The book is narrated by a young boy named Danny as he ages. It's about him and his sister and their turbulent childhood. And it's about a house that their father bought, thinking it would be a great real estate investment and great for their family. And ultimately the house just ends up being what breaks this family apart. But the house is such a deep central character in the book that Danny and his sister Maeve can't give it up. They go back and they visit the house. They park at the side of the street at night and they watch the house and they wonder what's going on in there. Ultimately, the book comes to a head when the characters confront the people in their lives who were ultimately the root of their disruption of their entire family life. And it's very beautifully done, and Tom Hanks is excellent at reading that book. The Chronicles of Narnia is obviously been around for a very long time, and is now in audiobooks, all separate audiobooks, the entire series. But the audiobooks are read by people like Kenneth Branagh, reads a couple of them. Patrick Stewart reads a couple of them. Lynn Redgrave reads a couple of them. Those would be great books to listen to. I haven't listened to them, but I would like to. I'd like to read them with my son, and then I would like to listen to them with my son. It's not a given that a great actor is going to be a great narrator, but some of these stage actors, the ones I've named, are probably a safe bet for narration of a book. I listened to a review of a newer release of The Adventures of Alice in Wonderland. It's read by Scarlett Johansson. And the review was very mixed. It did say she was great at characterization of other characters in the book, but she chose not to give Alice an English accent, and they found her affect a little bit bland in that way. So, but if you're a huge Scarlett Johansson fan, you probably won't care, because but reading, like everything else, is very personal, so it's what you like. Don't rely too heavily on reviews, but I think it's nice. I like reviews to get excited about a book. I don't generally get too turned off by books. I think I read reviews of things I already know I want to read or listen to. Another style of book that you can listen to, which had not dawned on me until I started reading about this audiobook, is poetry. You can listen to poetry on audiobook, which fascinates me, because I have a hard time with poetry. Poetry is there's a real voice to poetry, and a patience in the reading that you have to have, and it can be difficult to interpret poetry. It's very subjective to interpret poetry. Some people can probably open up a poetry book and read. I would rather listen to poetry, and now I can. Many poetry books are on audiobook. A couple that I wanted to note that I read about and listened to excerpts from. One is At Blackwater Pond by Mary Oliver, and it's Mary Oliver reading Mary Oliver. It's very beautiful if you are a fan of Mary Oliver, and I know there are many. That's a great one. And another one that I had not heard of, but I'm going to now see if I can find at the library, and if I can't, I might purchase it. It's called An American Sunrise, and it's by Joy Harjo. She is the Poet Laureate of the United States, and she's the first Native American Poet Laureate. She is a Muskogee person. She grew up in Oklahoma. And this book, An American Sunrise, is written in an oral history style, and she tackles the issues around how her ancestors were forcibly removed from their land. She talks about her mother's death. She talks about Native American rights and movements. And I listened to an excerpt, and I think she's a beautiful voice. She tells a beautiful story. It's not poetry. The excerpt that I listened to wasn't poetry like you might think of poetry. It was written in prose style. It was very much a story. I would recommend it. I'm gonna maybe do a little poetry book list for the library website, and I'll include this one on there. You can also listen to Emily Dickinson. You can listen to Rumi. You can listen to Jeremy Irons read T.S. Eliot. There's all kinds of poetry to listen to. So I just want to talk about a narrator. It's already 10:23, and then I'm going to recommend some books that come highly recommended and a couple that I've listened to that I've loved. So just a couple of points on the narrator. The narrator, as I said, can make or break the book for you. Really depends on their speaking style. It depends on the speed at which they speak, on how monotone they are, or how lively their voice is, how they do different characterizations. Can you tell the difference between an 8-year-old boy and his 17-year-old sister, and their 50-year-old mother, and the man down the street? You want to be able to discern voices, but not have it sound like too distracting. Another point about narration: some books are narrated by single narrators or a couple of different narrators. Some books have a full cast of narrators. So if you see an audiobook that it says full cast, that'll generally mean there's several narrators, or at least possibly a narrator for each character in the book. And one of the books I wanted to mention that is one of the biggest full cast audiobooks is Lincoln and the Bardo, which is George Saunders' first novel. It is about Abraham Lincoln dealing with the aftermath of his son Willie's death. His son Willie was 11 years old when he died. The book comes out of the history of that story, but it's actually called experimental fiction, what he's done with it. So he's borrowed from the history of the story, but he's gone on to tell what he believes Abraham Lincoln would have experienced in the Bardo. And the Bardo is a Tibetan tradition in which it's the period in between a Buddhist death and the new life of a Buddhist. So it's technically in Tibetan tradition, it's a 49-day period, but George Saunders has drawn from a couple of different traditions. He drew from Christianity and Egyptian religion to tell the story, but he talks about Lincoln mourning his son in the in-between interrupted life of his son, before his son is completely, right after his son's death, before he becomes reincarnated or is fully dead. People love this book. I have tried to read this book and listen to this book, and I can't get anywhere with it, but it comes so highly recommended. It was the Man Booker Prize of 2017. It might be worth a try. So that's a great example of a full cast book. Full cast book is one in which you have to pay a lot of attention because it sounds like a play where you're not exactly sure who everybody is right away. And over time, you get to recognize people's voices and know what character they are. But with 166 cast members, that's a lot of listening. Another way to find great audiobooks is to find a great narrator and then listen to several books by the same narrator. Bonnie Turpin is an actor. She has narrated over 100 audiobooks. She's won a bunch of audio awards, which is the awards given by the Audio Publishers Association. You can go to their website actually at audiopub.org and look at all of the winners of audiobook awards. But she has narrated The Hate You Give, Colson Whitehead's, which I have right here actually, Nickel Boys. She did this one. She did The Children of Blood and Bone. She did The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. She's done some Toni Morrison. She's a great narrator, and I think that she would be a great place to start if you're new and you're just looking for somebody who is objectively viewed as a great narrator. Finally, I will just mention briefly, because we don't have too much time left, some audiobooks that come highly recommended or that I recommend. Daisy Jones and the Six is a book by Taylor Jenkins Reid, came out last year. It's an oral history of a fictional band from the 70s, and it tells the story of the band, which kind of came together quickly and broke up abruptly in 1979. Daisy's the lead singer, and Billy is a band member. Talks about their relationship. It's done as an oral history, so it's done in an interview style. When you read the book, you're reading the interviewer's questions to various characters over various time periods. And you will believe, as you read the book, that Daisy Jones and the Six is a real band because it's told so well. And then by the end of the book, I think you'll wish they were a real band. This is a great audiobook told with a full cast. And I'd like to listen to that one now that I've read the book. Charlotte's Web, the latest version of Charlotte's Web by E.B. White, is out with Meryl Streep as the narrator and a full cast as well. That's a really sweet book to listen to. Lincoln and the Bardo I mentioned, and The Handmaid's Tale I mentioned. The Testaments, which is the sequel of The Handmaid's Tale, which takes place 15 years after The Handmaid's Tale, which is an excellent book. I have not listened to it, but I will now. I know it's narrated by three women in the book, but one is Aunt Lydia, one is a young woman that lives in Gilead, and one is a young woman that lives in Toronto. And if you've read The Handmaid's Tale, that will make sense to you, and if you have read the Testaments, you'll know what I mean. But Aunt Lydia in the book is narrated by Ann Dowd, who plays Aunt Lydia in the TV series, which again I haven't watched it, but I just did check out season 1 to myself today. So those are some books I would recommend to listen to. So don't forget also that I mentioned The Dutch House. It's great. In closing, I will remind you to go to audiofilemagazine.com to check out some of their reviews of audiobooks. You can check out the audiopub.org, which is the Audio Publishers Association website. And when you look on our catalog and you're looking for audiobooks, you can narrow your search on the left-hand side to audiobooks, and you can download audiobooks from Hoopla and Libby, as well as through Overdrive in our catalog. And our calendar this week, I just want to mention our calendar this week because we have a dinner Friday night, a virtual dinner. I think Teresa's hosting it. She's going to be making big salads. And on Thursday night, there is a recycled art night, collage art, using things that you have around your house, anything interesting. And then tomorrow night, Tuesday, there's a teen virtual game night You can register for all of those events ahead of time. So I hope you've learned something about audiobooks today. I do have a little stack here that I grabbed on my way here. Olive, again, such a lovely book, and I think would be a great audiobook. Catch and Kill, Ronan Farrow. I loved this book. He reads it. I didn't listen, I read it, but I listened to the podcast. He's just got a great speaking style. The Talking to Strangers, Malcolm Gladwell, which I mentioned. And this is The Body, a guide for occupants by Bill Bryson, which is a great book, but apparently a really great audiobook as well. So enjoy some audiobooks this week. Keep reading. Don't forget to check out Contactless Pickup, how to book that on winpublic.org, and we'll chat with you next Monday.